Welcome back to the channel, everyone. We get to finally talk about a phone that I got last year and I really haven't talked about since, but I rebought it and I can tell you like this, dude, the OnePlus 7 Pro is one of the most fascinating phones ever made. And it's funny because when this phone came out last year, actually a little bit less than a year ago, this phone made major news, and rightfully so. This was a phone that wasn't a flagship priced phone, but it was pretty much a flagship phone every single which way, and it overdid a lot of what the other competitors weren't even doing at the time. And I think even still it's a really good priced phone. When this thing first came out, I think it was around $799-ish, around that price tag. It's since depreciated quite a bit, and on Amazon you can pick one up for about $649, which is actually a really good price, but you can actually pick up the top tier model for about $630, which is a little bit better price. So I'll leave that link down in the description if you want to pick that one up, but also you can pick them up on eBay for pretty cheap too, so it's totally up to you. But I can definitely tell you the price tag of the OnePlus 7 Pro is still extremely cheap for what you are getting. And since this phone's release, we've seen the OnePlus 7T and the 7T Pro get released, as well as the new Galaxy S20s. And I can tell you this phone, in terms of the design, has still so much going for it. And I think with the S20 and the S20 Ultra, those phones are definitely probably the best phones ever made in terms of the Android standpoint. But the OnePlus 7 Pro, for what it brought in such a probably cheaper package than usual, is a seriously impressive thing, and I have a lot of respect for OnePlus for doing that. So looking on the front of the OnePlus 7 Pro, we have a 6.67-inch Fluid AMOLED display, and it's a 1440p display, and it's a very good display. It's very good. I think this was the first time we saw a 1440p display on a OnePlus phone for a while at least. And this phone's display was so cool. You had really so much going for it. It had a little bezel all around the whole entire body. The screen to body ratio was extremely high. You didn't have any hole punch display or anything like that. And this was not the first time I think we've seen a bezel-less display like this, but it was pretty close to almost bezel-less if I'm being honest. Now, as you guys know, the face camera or the front facing camera was a pop-up camera on the top, and still to this day, like even almost a year later, I still don't know how I feel about that. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't really like that. I wish it was probably a hole punch display. That would have been a little bit better, but having that camera go up and down constantly is something that I really don't like, and I don't think a lot of other people liked it either. You know what I mean? I mean, it's cool that when you don't want to use it, it's out of the way, but also it's just one extra component that can break over time. And they had this really cool feature on it that if it detected the phone falling, the camera would actually protrude back into the camera, which is actually really interesting, or the camera would protrude back into the phone, or whatever the case is. And I think that's really cool, and I think it was OnePlus taking the step into making sure it wouldn't break, but it's still not my favorite concept if I'm being honest. Everything else about this phone is pretty cool except that one little thing which kind of made this phone look how it was. So you also have a fingerprint sensor in the display, but you also have that 90 Hz refresh rate on this display, which really made this phone stand out last year's in terms of all the other phones that came out, including over the S10, the 10, the 11 actually, and all those phones. This one had the capability of doing 90 Hz refresh rate on that display, which is seriously impressive. I really do like that a lot, and I'm glad OnePlus put this in. I mean, that's seriously really impressive. I give them a lot of credit for putting that type of technology in a phone that's technically cheaper than a lot of other flagships that couldn't even do the same. So shout out to OnePlus for doing that. I really do appreciate that. And it's honestly making it sound like they did it just for me, and they did it. On the bottom you can see we have a USB Type-C port. On the back we have a triple camera setup, which is really interesting, and a glass back. And this phone, I'll tell you, dude, I'll be the first one to tell you, it still feels like a very premium phone. It feels just as good as my S20, like it really does. It's a pretty big phone too, which is something that a lot of people might like, and it's just so futuristic to see this thing have like no bezel. Like, it's just so crazy. Hopefully one day we'll get that with iOS and iPhones and everything, but I guess we'll wait and see what happens. But no micro SD card slot and no IP certification, which is kind of weird, especially now in 2020. All phones should have some type of capability of having IP certification, and this phone does not have it, which is really bad. I don't really like that at all. And this phone, on top of all that, does not have wireless charging, which is insane. How does a phone in 2020 not have, or even 2019 that was released, not have IP certification and or wireless charging? You know what I mean? It just doesn't make any sense. But this specific phone does not have either of those qualifications, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. We can't really do anything about it now. But overall, I like the body. It still feels like a very good phone, and I have a lot of respect for OnePlus for pushing it out. So in terms of the outside, that really pretty much covers it. Now, hitting on the software, this thing was released with Android Pie on Oxygen OS, and we are able to get Android 10 on it. I think at some point we're going to get Android 11, and then that's probably it. However, the cool thing about OnePlus phones is that they're pretty easy to root in custom ROM. They were once tag teamed up with the CyanogenMod back in the day. Now that CyanogenMod is LineageOS, and they split ties a long time ago after their first phone. And since then, OxygenOS and OnePlus, they really wanted to make it more so, I guess, more stockish Android with more built-in features, and then a full-on custom ROM and all those things. And I can tell you, in terms of being a stock OS, OxygenOS is probably the best of both worlds. You're stock, you're not rooted or anything like that, but you still have so much capability. You have that stock software, and it kind of does feel like a custom ROM at the end of the day, which is really cool. And that's why I love OnePlus so much. You know, their software is one of the better, so I think it's better than stock Android, to be honest. And it's funny because a lot of people say stock Android is the best, but in my opinion, OxygenOS, after all the phones that I've owned, after every single OnePlus phone that I've owned, I think OxygenOS is probably the best version of Android so far. So in terms of software, you're probably going to get another version of software on top of this one, but that's really pretty much it, which isn't a bad thing either. But you still have those custom ROMs and everything that you can install on after if you feel to do so. So that's really pretty much it in terms of the software standpoint. Now hitting on the performance, this thing was released with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset, an octa-core CPU, and Adreno 640 GPU, and there's 3 different models of this phone. The base model with 128 gigs with 6 gigabytes of RAM, and there's 2 256 gig models. One has 8 gigabytes of RAM, the other has 12 gigabytes of RAM. And what I can tell you about the performance is now for me personally, I have the base model, and what I can tell you about the performance is that it's a very good performing phone still. You know, it's gotten the software update, which didn't make it slower, which is really nice, at least from the last time I used it. And it's a very good performing phone. There's really not too much to hate on it. And I say this every time, but there really isn't anything to hate on it for this specific phone. Because it's so stock, there's not a lot of background processes, unlike something like One UI or LG's UI or something like that. This phone has very little going on in the background, which is very, very nice. And the thing is that whenever I open an app or I close an app or whatever, it gets to it just in time, and it opens it just as fast as I wanted it to, which is really cool. And there's nothing in me that finds anything wrong or flawed with it. The cool thing is with that 90Hz refresh rate, it makes everything on this phone feel that much smoother, which is really cool. Typically, with phones, we're so used to that 60 Hz, and this one just brings it to another level. Now with the Galaxy S20, obviously we have that 120 Hz, but this one is still really, really good. And you're still going to see pretty big differences from 60 Hz to 90 Hz. And I can tell you the performance of this phone, whether you're an extreme user, whether you're a basic user, it's going to be very, very good. What I will tell you though is that if you get that top tier 12 gig model, that's going to probably future proof you a lot more than getting the base model that I have. So kind of keep that in mind, especially considering the fact that the Galaxy S20 and those phones have 12 gigs of RAM. You can base up this model and you can get the top tier model and still feel like you have a very, very fast performing phone even now in 2020. That's probably competitive to the top tier phone. So what I'll tell you is in terms of the performance, it's a very good performing phone. If you're okay with 6 gigs of RAM, then keep it, to get the base model. But if you need a little bit more performance, get the top tier model. That'll probably be the best way to go. So that pretty much covers it up there. Now hitting on the camera sensor, this thing has a triple camera setup, like I said before, a 48 megapixel wide angle lens, an 8 megapixel telephoto lens, and a 16 megapixel ultra wide sensor. And the camera on this thing, I think it's cool, the fact that it has triple cameras, or it has 3 cameras. I think that's a really, really cool thing. However, the only downside is that the camera quality just isn't as great as you might have expected it to be. I mean, when I first saw that keynote, and I watched the keynote last year when we could have keynotes, if you know what I mean, and I watched it and I was like, wow, this is a really, really good camera, and OnePlus was really hyping the phone up as they should. And ultimately, when I bought it and I started testing it, it looks good, but definitely compared to something like at that time the Galaxy S10 or even the iPhone XS, it definitely had a long way to go in my opinion. And it has the camera sensors, which is cool. It has the telephoto and ultra wide sensor, but I think the quality could have definitely been better. So in my opinion, you can do 4K 60 frames, which is really cool. And like I said, with that front camera 16 megapixel wide angle lens, and it's motorized, which is really, really cool. Whether you use it or not, you have that capability, which is, I guess, is cool. But at the end of the day, I think the camera is pretty average. It's nothing that's going to wow you, but it's not bad either. So it's definitely a little bit above average for sure, but nothing that'll wow you. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 4,000 mAh battery, and I will tell you the battery life is still pretty decent. This phone, surprisingly, the one I got, hasn't really depreciated that much in battery. It's only been a little bit less than a year, but still phones can depreciate pretty fast. And I have my 90Hz refresh run on too, and it actually wasn't that bad. Maybe it has something to do with Android 10, I'm not too sure. But the battery life is better now than when I first bought it brand new back in the day, at least back last year. So that's actually pretty crazy. I wasn't expecting that, but with the 4,000 mAh battery, that's still very respectable. It has a lot going for it. And if you look at the Galaxy S20, that thing has the same size battery as this one too. And I think Samsung took a lot of cues from the OnePlus 7 Pro, to be honest. They increased the refresh rate, increased the battery size to to this same one. They kind of look the same, to be honest, but ultimately what I can tell you is the OnePlus 7 Pro still worth it in 2020? I'll say 100% yes, this phone is still completely worth it in 2020. It's a very good phone. There's really nothing to hate on it, you know what I mean? It's such a good phone still, and Oxygen OS, the software pretty much just makes up for all the kind of shortcomings and everything, and ultimately at the end of the day, I like the OnePlus 7 Pro, and if you're looking for a pretty good phone still in 2020 that's used or that is older, I would highly recommend the OnePlus 7 Pro. So that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.